Okay, let's unpack this. Close your eyes for a second and picture Europe at the very start of the 20th century. Forget the sepia tones of old photographs. Think vibrant color, dynamic motion,
Right.
towering new factories, belching smoke, massive cities humming with electric light, railroads crisscrossing the landscape, ships steaming across oceans powered by the might of industry. This continent is absolutely pulsating with energy, with wealth, with power.
It's a picture of incredible progress and strength, isn't it?
Right.
What's fascinating, though, is how that very engine of progress, industrialization, instead of forging unity, seemed to sharpen the edges of old rivalries and carve out entirely new ones. It created a continent that was thriving, yes, but simultaneously teetering on the edge of something profoundly destructive.
Precisely. And that tension, that volatile mix of power and instability, is the core of what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into the historical context of international relations during a period that truly reshaped the world, from the early 1900s right through to the end of World War II.
Yeah, huge span of time.
We've been exploring a stack of articles and research that act as our guide through this incredibly complex and often brutal chapter of history.
Our mission here isn't just to recite a timeline of who fought whom and when. It's about peeling back the layers to understand the why. What were the deep currents of change, the underlying forces driving these nations?
Yeah, the real drivers.
Who were the key players, and what were the pivotal moments where different paths might have been taken but weren't? It's about grasping the forces that didn't just redraw maps, but fundamentally altered the global order for generations.
Because this isn't just academic history tucked away in textbooks. The events of this era, the rise of industrial powers, the scramble for global resources, the devastating impact of world wars, the uneasy peace that followed their echoes, are still felt today.
Absolutely. In international relations, in economic systems, in political dynamics.
Understanding this turbulent time is absolutely crucial for making sense of the world we live in right now.
And the insights we'll be sharing, they come directly from the sources we've been poring over. We've pulled out the core nuggets of knowledge, aiming to give you a curated look at the essential details and connections without getting bogged down in every single historical aside.
So taking that picture of a powerful but deeply uneasy Europe as our starting point. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's begin by setting the stage, looking at how Europe was transformed and what powers were truly shaping the landscape at the turn of the century.
To understand the political backdrop, we have to acknowledge the foundation laid centuries earlier. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, for instance, it sort of solidified the concept of the sovereign nation-state.
Right.
It established these distinct political entities as the main actors on the European stage, setting the political canvas upon which everything else would be painted.
Right, so you have this system of independent states, each concerned with its own power and security. But then came the real game changers, the forces that injected incredible new energy and also incredible new tension into that system.
Yeah.
We're talking about the intellectual shifts of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, but above all, the sheer transformative power of the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about new machines. It was a revolution in economic and military capacity. It put European nations on a path of unprecedented growth and power.
Yeah.
By 1900, you had several key players who had ridden this wave to become economic powerhouses. The sources highlight France, Britain, Belgium, the old Habsburg Empire, but also emerging powers like Japan, Italy, the USA, and critically, Germany. These weren't just countries, they were industrial engines.
And what do powerful industrial engines need? Resources and markets.
Exactly.
This is where that economic strength directly fueled imperialism and colonialism. Suddenly, these nations had the means and the motive to project their power globally. Africa and Asia became, as one source puts it, the new battlegrounds.
Right, a real scramble.
This wasn't just about planting flags. It was a frantic race for raw materials to feed factories and new populations to buy manufactured goods.
This global scramble for resources and territory injected immense tension. The more powerful these industrial economies became, the more their spheres of interest overlapped and clashed outside of Europe. It was a zero-sum game. Really, one nation's gain in Africa or Asia was another's loss.
And while the established European powers were busy with this intense competition and their internal dynamics, two significant new players were rapidly gaining strength, developing somewhat outside the traditional European power struggles.
First, the United States. The sources note that after securing its independence in 1776 and navigating its Civil War, America had a remarkable century, roughly from 1800 to 1900, of relative peace on its own continent.
focused inwards.
While Europe was consumed by revolutions, industrialization, and the intense race for colonies, the U.S. was able to focus its energy and vast resources inwards, pursuing steady economic development.
Right.
This period of internal focus, free from major external threats, allowed the U.S. to build its industrial and economic base quietly, positioning it to emerge as a potentially strong player by the time World War I dramatically altered the global stage.
Then there was Germany. United relatively late under Bismarck, Germany underwent astonishingly rapid industrialization. They didn't just build an economy, they built one that quickly surpassed France and even Britain economically by 1900.
Quite a feat, really.
Empowered by this, Germany rapidly moved into acquiring colonies, a policy known as Weltpolitik or world politics. This was Germany asserting its place on the global stage, demanding its share.
And that rapid economic rise and aggressive entry into the colonial game was deeply disruptive to the established order,
Definitely. With this newfound economic wealth, Germany naturally began investing heavily in its military, and critically, its navy.
Yes, the naval race. This led to a tremendous rise in Anglo-German naval rivalry. Britain, having long enjoyed naval supremacy as the basis of its global empire and security, saw Germany's burgeoning fleet not just as competition, but as an existential threat.
Yeah, it went right to the heart of British power.
The race to build more battleships became a powerful symbol of the growing tension between these two economic giants.
And this brings us to a core dynamic of the period. These powerful economies, eyeing each other's growth and global reach, were consumed by deep suspicion and insecurity. As the sources point out, there was a pervasive fear that any other nation could become too economically powerful, capable of challenging or even dominating others.
That sense of mutual fear and distrust was the primary driver behind the formation of alliances. Nations sought security not just through their own strength, but by linking their fate to others.
Trying to find safety in numbers.
Exactly. The goal was often to balance the power of potential rivals or prevent any single nation from becoming overwhelmingly dominant. This process began with the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1882. Then came the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894.
And crucially, the British and French put aside centuries of rivalry to sign the Entente Cordiale in 1904. Quite a shift.
A huge shift. The sources underline that these alliances played a very important role in the eventual outbreak of World War I. Some historians even see the complex dance of maintaining the balance of power through these rigid pacts as the single biggest cause.
But, and this is an important nuance from the sources, it's too simplistic to blame only the alliances, right?
Exactly. They emphasize that while the alliances were crucial in escalating a conflict, many other immediate causes were also responsible. Specifically, they highlight that colonial rivalry was certainly a much bigger contributory factor, along with the fervor of intense nationalism.
So you have this potent cocktail, powerful industrial economies competing globally, bound by interlocking security treaties and bubbling with fervent national pride.
It was a system primed for crisis.
And those crises weren't long in coming. Nationalism in particular was a huge piece of this explosive puzzle. Let's look at some specific flashpoints, case studies of how these underlying forces manifested and pushed Europe closer to the edge.
A classic example of how intense nationalism created a direct source of conflict, particularly in the volatile Balkans, is the situation surrounding Serbia and Bosnia.
Bosnia.
The sources identify this as a root cause of Serbian dissent and a major point of contention with Austria-Hungary.
Right. We have to go back to the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. This treaty gave Austria the right to administer the province of Bosnia, even though Bosnia remained officially part of the weakened Turkish Empire.
A sort of awkward arrangement. This left Turkey unhappy but pretty powerless to resist.
Meanwhile, Serbia harbored a powerful, almost mystical nationalistic dream to create a greater Serbia.
Yes, this vision to unite all Serbs and Croats scattered across the Balkans into a large, unified kingdom called Yugoslavia.
And achieving this dream required, absolutely, essentially, gaining control over Bosnia, which had a significant Serb population.
Austria-Hungary, however, saw Serbian nationalism as an existential threat. With its own large Serb population within its empire, Vienna knew that if Serbia succeeded in uniting ethnic Serbs and Croats, it would dangerously endanger the stability of the entire Habsburg Empire.
So Austria's goal was clear.
They wanted to put an end to this Serbian nationalist movement. Simple as that from their perspective.
This already fraught situation was further complicated by Russia's involvement. Russia openly supported Serbia.
Seeing the Balkans as a region ripe for Russian influence and expansion, perhaps the only territory left without significant European colonial penetration. Naturally, the Austrian authorities did not appreciate this Russian backing of their rival, not one bit.
So by the early 1900s, you have this highly unstable dynamic. Serbian nationalism pushing for control of Austrian-administered territory, Austria desperate to suppress that movement for its own survival, and Russia supporting Serbia, bringing a major power into the regional dispute.
Nationalism wasn't just a feeling. It was a direct political force driving confrontation between multiple nations. It gets very real very quickly.
Let's look at how the alliances were tested in a major diplomatic showdown, the crisis in Morocco between 1905 and 1906.
Okay. The background here is that relatively new 1904 British-French understanding, the Entente Cordiale.
Right.
Germany was definitely alarmed by this alignment between their two major rivals. They wanted to see if this Entente was truly robust, if it would genuinely hold fast under duress.
So they poked it.
Pretty much. They decided to apply that duress in Morocco, a territory in North Africa that hadn't been fully carved up by colonial powers yet. France had ambitions to control the Moroccan police and banking system. Germany, however, decided to challenge France's influence directly. They openly asserted their own interests in Morocco, supporting the independent Moroccan Sultan against French encroachment.
This led to Germany calling for an international conference in Algeciras, Spain in 1906 to discuss Morocco's future.
Right. At the conference, Britain understood the stakes. If Germany succeeded in asserting its control over Morocco through the Sultan, it would be a significant victory of German diplomacy and a major boost to Germany's Weltpolitik, their push for global standing.
So Britain had to react.
Recognizing the threat, Britain made a clear choice and sided firmly with France. To Germany's surprise and dismay, France also received support for its proposals from Spain, Russia, and even Italy.
Italy, even though they were allied with Germany and Austria.
Yes, despite Italy's nominal alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the conference concluded with majority support for the French plan. The sources describe this outcome as a big diplomatic boost for the British and French Entente, confirming its strength, and a big blow to German prestige and diplomatic efforts.
So that test in Morocco really solidified the British-French bond.
It did. And the next year, in 1907, Britain and Russia also signed an agreement. This seemed like a natural next step, given France was allied with both Britain since 1904 and Russia since 1894.
Joining the dots.
Exactly. Russia was in a difficult position financially after its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They needed investment and financial help, which Britain could provide.
But the British weren't keen on the Tsar, were they?
Well, they were initially hesitant to ally closely with the autocratic Russian Tsar Nicholas II. However, following the 1905 revolution, the Tsar had made some limited concessions, including granting freedom of speech, which was apparently enough for the British to overcome their reluctance and proceed with the financial and political agreement.
Now look at the map again. You have Britain allied with France, France allied with Russia, and now Britain allied with Russia. This constellation of agreements effectively created the Triple Entente.
Right, a powerful alignment encircling Germany and Austria-Hungary.
The sources state that Germany, seeing Britain now formally linked to both Russia and France, became deeply concerned again. This period marked the definitive development of Germany's fear of encirclement by the British and their allies.
And this growing fear and suspicion were immediately tested again, bringing us back to that volatile region, Bosnia. Crisis erupted there again in 1908.
As a reminder, under the 1878 Treaty of Berlin, Austria administered Bosnia, which was still technically Turkish territory. This created resentment for both the Turks and the Serbs, who wanted Bosnia for Greater Serbia.
Yes, that lingering issue. In 1908, a nationalist reform movement known as the Young Turks emerged forcefully in Turkey. They demanded that Bosnia, along with other lost territories, be returned to full Turkish control.
So Austria felt pressured.
Seeing the Young Turks' demand and fearing they might actually act on it, Austria-Hungary decided to preempt them and formally annex Bosnia outright, removing any ambiguity about its status. Just took it.
Which must have enraged Serbia.
Oh, absolutely. For Serbia, getting Bosnia was central to their national dream. They saw Austria stealing their future and immediately appealed to their supporter, Russia, for help.
And Germany's reaction?
Swift and decisive. They publicly announced their open support for Austria's annexation. Russia, with its own ambitions in the Balkans and its self-appointed role as protector of the Slavs, saw Bosnia as an apt moment to assert itself against Austrian expansion.
But could they?
Well, despite its desire, Russia simply lacked the military strength in 1908 to back up Serbia with a credible threat of force against Austria and Germany. Russia tried to rally support for Serbia at an international conference, but it came to nothing.
And Britain and France.
What was notable was their reaction. Britain and France, Germany's main rivals in the Entente, avoided any direct confrontation with Austria and Germany over the Bosnia issue. They were not prepared to risk a major war over this specific territorial dispute.
So Austria got away with it.
The outcome was a major diplomatic victory for Austria and Germany. Austria successfully annexed Bosnia. The Russians were left feeling deeply humiliated by their inability to protect Serbia or stand up to the Central Powers.
That humiliation must have stung.
It did. The sources state that, determined not to be powerless again, Russia embarked upon massive military mobilization and rearmament programs to build up its strength for future confrontations. And the Serbs, their national dream thwarted and their appeals ignored, became extremely hostile to both Austria and Germany.
So the fear of encirclement in Germany was intensifying, while Russia and Serbia were nursing a deep grievance and building military power. Then, in 1911, tensions flared again, this time in the port of Agadir, once again in Morocco.
Right, back to Morocco. This crisis stemmed from the French securing control over Moroccan banks and police following the 1905-06 Algeciras Conference. In 1911, the French moved troops into Morocco, ostensibly to protect Europeans there, but also to solidify their control and keep the Moroccan Sultan in line.
And Germany saw this as overreach.
Yes, they saw this French troop movement as interference in Morocco's internal affairs, despite the Algeciras Agreement. Their response was dramatic. They sent a German gunboat, the Panther, directly to the port of Agadir on Morocco's Atlantic coast.
Sending a gunboat, that's quite a statement.
The intention behind sending the Panther, according to the sources, was clearly to pressure France. Germany wanted to force France to seek a settlement, and, in return for acknowledging French influence in Morocco, Germany intended to demand compensation, specifically territory in the French Congo.
This German naval presence in Agadir immediately triggered alarm bells in Britain.
Of course. The British viewed a German gunboat in a strategic port like Agadir not just as a challenge to France, but as a potential move by Germany to establish or enhance a naval base there.
Which threatened British sea lanes.
Exactly. And any increased German naval presence on the Atlantic coast was seen by Britain as a direct threat to its free passage in the seas nearby, crucial for its global empire.
But did it work for Germany?
No. The French stood firm and refused Germany's demands for compensation. Despite the show of force with the gunboat, Germany ultimately, again, ended up accepting Morocco as a French protectorate.
Another setback for Germany.
The sources interpret this outcome as another victory of the Entente, reinforcing the idea of British and French supremacy in diplomatic contests against Germany during this period.
Another diplomatic setback for Germany, another reinforcement of the Entente's strength, and another layer of German resentment. While these diplomatic battles were unfolding, the Balkans remained a tinderbox, and it finally erupted into war between 1912 and 1913.
Yes, the Balkan Wars. The Balkans were a region in the east largely consisting of territories previously held by the rapidly weakening Ottoman or Turkish Empire. Key states in the area were Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and Bulgaria. By 1912, the Turkish Empire was clearly in decline.
An opportunity for the neighbors.
Precisely. Seeing this weakness, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria formed a Balkan League. Their objective was simple: to attack the remaining Ottoman territories in Europe and expand their own borders.
How did the big powers react?
This outbreak of war in the Balkans immediately alarmed the major European powers, particularly Britain and Germany. Fearing the conflict would draw them in, they jointly organized a conference in London in 1912. They put forward a settlement plan designed to stop the Balkan states' territorial expansion and contain the conflict.
But there were complications, I assume, especially regarding Serbia.
The British, especially wary of the implications of a stronger Serbia, were instrumental in part of this plan. To prevent Serbia from gaining too much power in the region and threatening Austria-Hungary, the settlement insisted on the creation of an independent Albania.
Blocking Serbia's sea access.
Exactly. This was a major blow to Serbia. Serbia had desperately wanted Albania to be part of Greater Serbia because it would give them vital access to the sea. Sea access would significantly strengthen Serbia and, conversely, weaken Austria-Hungary's position relative to a larger, more powerful Serbia. The sources confirmed that the Serbs were extremely dissatisfied with the creation of an independent Albania.
And Bulgaria wasn't happy either.
No. The settlement also left Bulgaria unhappy, as it felt cheated out of territories, particularly Macedonia, which went to Serbia. This resentment led to the Second Balkan War, where Bulgaria attacked Serbia.
And Austria saw a chance.
Austria-Hungary, seeing an opportunity to finally crush Serbian nationalism, wanted to support Bulgaria. However, the war between Bulgaria and Serbia was swift. Bulgaria was defeated.
So Austria missed its chance.
Yes, and crucially, the major powers, Britain and Germany, managed to contain the conflict. The Treaty of Bucharest in 1913 ended the war quickly, largely through British and German diplomatic influence, preventing Austria-Hungary from intervening militarily against Serbia.
So the outcome, more instability.
The outcome of these Balkan Wars, despite the major powers' attempts to control them, left the region extremely volatile. Old resentments festered, especially in Serbia, which emerged from the wars feeling resurgent after gaining territory, though denied Albania, but also deeply hostile towards Austria and Germany.
So let's connect the dots on this decade and a half of crises. What we see is a clear pattern. Each event, Morocco, Bosnia, Agadir, the Balkans, acted like a stress test on the alliance system.
They didn't cause the war alone, but they deepened the existing suspicions, reinforced the rigidity of the alliances, highlighted the ambitions of the rising powers,
Like Germany, Serbia, Russia, and the Balkans.
and demonstrated the explosive potential of nationalism and unresolved territorial claims. Europe was accumulating an immense amount of tension.
Which brings us, tragically but almost inevitably given the pressure building, to the descent into the First Global War. The outline and sources lay out the steps that, once set in motion, led the continent over the brink in just a few weeks.
The immediate trigger was the assassination on June 28, 1914. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, that very province whose annexation by Austria had caused such a stir in 1908 and was coveted by Serbia.
Right in the heart of the tension.
While there, he was shot and killed by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb student and member of a Serbian nationalist group.
Austria-Hungary, convinced that Serbia was behind the assassination plot, saw this as the perfect opportunity or justification to finally deal with Serbian nationalism once and for all.
This was their chance. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia.
And this is where the alliance system, refined and solidified over the preceding decades, kicked into terrifying gear.
Yes. Serbia, facing war with Austria-Hungary, immediately appealed to its protector, Russia, for help. Russia, as the sources note, was determined, never wanted a repeat of its failure to help Serbia as earlier, in 1908, during the Bosnian annexation crisis.
So Russia mobilized,
Russia ordered immediate, full military mobilization.
which Germany couldn't ignore.
Russia's mobilization was a direct threat to Austria-Hungary, and by extension, to its ally, Germany. Germany demanded that Russia halt its mobilization. The sources state that Russia's outright refusal to comply was the direct trigger that compelled Germany to declare war on Russia.
And because of the Franco-Russian alliance.
Knowing the terms of the Franco-Russian agreement, Germany immediately assumed that France would come to Russia's aid. Therefore, Germany declared war on France as well, anticipating that they would have to fight both powers simultaneously.
Germany's war plan, often referred to as the Schlieffen Plan.
Though the sources don't name it, they describe its execution. It was to knock France out quickly by attacking through neutral Belgium before Russia could fully mobilize its vast army.
But Belgium was neutral, guaranteed by Britain.
Exactly. Belgium had been a neutral state, and its neutrality had been guaranteed by Britain way back in 1839. When Germany began its invasion of Belgium to attack France, Britain delivered an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw from Belgium.
Germany refused.
Germany refused. This refusal led Britain to declare war on Germany. Within weeks, a localized conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had, through the chain reaction of mutual defense treaties, engulfed all the major powers of Europe.
Just like that. So at the outset, the primary belligerents solidified into the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, facing off against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey.
And Italy, interestingly, was initially part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but would eventually switch sides and fight against them, ending up as a victorious allied power. A complicated situation there.
What about the U.S.?
The United States, across the Atlantic, initially remained officially neutral. While sympathetic to Britain and France and already providing them with supplies, the U.S. government and public were reluctant to become fully entangled in a European war.
But things changed.
Several events chipped away at this neutrality and shifted public opinion. The sources mention the Zimmermann telegram.
Ah, yes, Germany trying to get Mexico involved.
Exactly, where the U.S. intercepted a German proposal to Mexico, suggesting an alliance against the United States. The unrestricted submarine warfare waged by Germany, sinking ships, including those with American citizens aboard, was another major factor.
And the Russian Revolution.
The sources also note that the Russian Revolution in April 1917, which overthrew the autocratic Tsar, may have made Russia a more palatable ally for the democratic U.S., removing an ideological barrier to joining the Entente powers. A bit easier to ally with a republic, perhaps.
Regardless of the precise mix of factors, the U.S. formally entered World War I against Germany in April 1917.
And the sources emphasize that the entry of the United States, with its vast industrial capacity and manpower, significantly strengthened the Allied side and was crucial in helping to conclude the war.
The war that followed was unlike any before it. The sources describe it as the first ever modern, total, and global war.
It wasn't confined to professional armies fighting on specific battlefields. It involved industrial economies producing weapons on an unprecedented scale, civilian populations mobilized on the home front for the war effort.
In conflicts spanning multiple continents and oceans, truly engaging also people on a large scale, far from the front lines.
So, what does this all mean? It means that the carefully constructed system of alliances, intended to provide security and balance power, ultimately failed. Spectacularly.
Instead, it acted as a mechanism for rapid, uncontrollable escalation.
A regional crisis, fueled by intense nationalism and underlying rivalries, became a global catastrophe because the major powers were bound by treaties that left them no easy way to back down.
And the end of this devastating war didn't bring lasting peace. The treaties that followed set the stage for the next global conflict. Let's look at the uneasy peace that was negotiated and how it sowed the seeds for future problems.
As World War I finally ended, the victorious powers included Britain, France, the USA, Russia, and Italy. On the losing side were the Central Powers, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Germany.
Though Russia's situation was complicated by then.
It's important to remember that despite technically being on the winning side, Russia's internal revolution and withdrawal from the war significantly impacted its standing relative to the other victorious powers.
The sources are quite direct about the outcome of the peace negotiations, stating that the multiple treaties created after World War I gave birth to future conflicts, including the WW2.
Yeah, not exactly a ringing endorsement. The way the war was ended wasn't a solution. It was, in many ways, the problem.
The most famous and arguably most consequential of these was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, dealing specifically with Germany. The sources call it a landmark treaty.
It was landmark for several reasons. Notably, it contained the League Covenant, which established the League of Nations, the first attempt at a global organization dedicated to preventing future wars through collective security.
But it was also very punitive towards Germany.
Oh, absolutely. The dominant feature of Versailles was the punitive treatment of Germany. At its heart were the demands for German reparations, forcing Germany to pay vast sums for the damages caused by the war.
And the sources say this sowed the seeds.
Unequivocally, these reparation demands, among other harsh terms, sowed the seeds for the WWC. The explicit goal, particularly for France, was to ensure Germany would never again be strong enough to threaten Britain and France.
So limiting their military, their economy?
Yes, harsh limits on Germany's military size and capabilities, significant restrictions on its economy, the loss of all its colonial possessions, and demands to share key resources with the victors.
Germany also suffered tremendous territorial losses.
It lost 12% of its population and 13% of its territory. The sources highlight the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France as one of Germany's biggest losses, land that had been taken after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871.
And the Polish Corridor.
Germany was also geographically split by the creation of the Polish Corridor, a strip of land carved out to give newly independent Poland access to the Baltic Sea, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. A major source of resentment.
It's worth noting that there wasn't complete agreement among the victors on how severely to treat Germany, was there?
No, definitely not. The sources point out the difference between France, which had suffered 2 German invasions in recent history and wanted a very weak Germany, and Britain, which desired Germany to be weak enough to be no threat, but still strong enough to function as a market and trade partner for British goods.
A crucial difference in perspective.
This underlying difference in approach among the victors would have implications later on.
Beyond Germany, the other Central Powers faced similar dismantling through separate treaties. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example.
Yes, the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1919 dissolved the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire. Austria lost tremendous territory. Bohemia and Moravia went to the newly formed state of Czechoslovakia. Dalmatia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina were given to Serbia, which merged with Montenegro to form the new enlarged state of Yugoslavia. Parts of its eastern territories went to Poland, Romania, and Italy gained South Tyrol and Istria. The empire was completely broken apart.
And Hungary.
The Treaty of Trianon in 1920 dealt with Hungary, and its impact was devastating. Hungary lost a staggering 2/3 of its territory. Slovakia and Ruthenia went to the Czechs, joining Bohemia and Moravia to form Czechoslovakia. Burgenland went to Austria, Croatia, and Slovenia to Yugoslavia, and Transylvania went to Romania. It was a radical dismemberment.
Bulgaria, too, lost territory.
Under the Treaty of Noyau in 1919, Western Thrace was given to Greece, Dobruja to Romania, and Northern Macedonia to Yugoslavia.
Finally, the Ottoman Empire.
The vast Ottoman Empire was partitioned by the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, though this treaty was later renegotiated. The sources detail the imposition of the mandate system.
Where territories were placed under the administration of victorious powers.
Right. Britain received mandates over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France received mandates over Syria and Lebanon. This wasn't outright colonization, but administration under League of Nations oversight, a system controversial from the start, often seen as a thinly veiled form of colonial control.
And Turkey itself.
Parts of Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and East Thrace were initially given to Greece and Italy, but a revised treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, returned East Thrace, Smyrna, and Constantinople to Turkey, establishing the borders of modern Turkey. Saudi Arabia also emerged as an independent state.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale and speed of the map redrawing across Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East.
It really is. The sources highlight how these radical territorial changes, combined with the harsh reparations imposed on Germany, immediately created deeply disgruntled parties. Germany, feeling humiliated and economically crippled, and Italy, feeling it hadn't received sufficient territorial gains despite being a victor, were two of the most significant.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these weren't just lines drawn on maps in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. These were arbitrary divisions of populations, resources, and historical lands, often ignoring ethnic or national aspirations, especially in the new states created in Eastern Europe and the mandates in the Middle East.
The sources emphasize that these treaties, far from establishing a stable peace, had sown seeds for deep resentment, leading to future conflict.
Alongside the treaties, there was the earnest attempt to prevent future wars, the League of Nations.
Yes, born out of the League Covenant embedded in the Treaty of Versailles. It was a revolutionary idea aiming for global cooperation. Before its formal establishment, there was a temporary diplomatic body handling immediate post-war issues, the Conference of Ambassadors.
The fundamental idea of the League was collective security. The principle was that if one member state was attacked, all other member states would come to its aid, collectively resisting the aggression.
A deterrent, hopefully.
That was the hope,
Yeah.
that the threat of collective action would deter any potential aggressor. However, the sources are clear-eyed about its ultimate outcome. The League did fail to preserve peace, given that World War II happened during its existence.
But they also caution against blaming the League solely for WW2.
Right, acknowledging the complex web of other causes. The League wasn't entirely without success. It successfully arbitrated the dispute over the Alan Islands between Finland and Sweden, preventing potential conflict.
And it set up useful bodies.
It also did good work establishing and overseeing effective sub-organizations focused on labor issues, refugee crises, and public health, many of which continued their work under the later United Nations. So some lasting positive impact there.
But its weaknesses were profound and ultimately crippling.
They were. The most critical failure, highlighted by the sources, was the refusal of the United States Senate to ratify the League Covenant and the Treaty of Versailles.
Why was that?
The U.S. Senate was particularly hesitant about Article X of the Covenant, which committed member states to defending each other's territory and independence against aggression. They feared this would draw the U.S. into future European conflicts.
And the U.S. not joining was a big deal.
The sources state that the U.S. not signing the Treaty of Versailles and therefore not joining the League had a huge impact, depriving the organization of the economic and political weight of the world's most powerful emerging nation.
So the post-treaty period wasn't stable at all.
The sources summarize it starkly. It was not a relatively stable period. This instability stemmed directly from the deep resentment sown by the treaties, particularly felt by Germany and Italy.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? Can an international body truly be effective in preserving peace and ensuring compliance without the full commitment and participation of all the major global powers?
It's the key question, I think. The League lacked independent military force and relied on the willingness of its members to act collectively, a willingness often absent when their own interests weren't directly threatened or when economic crises made intervention difficult.
And that instability and deep resentment became defining features of the period between the two world wars, roughly 1919 to 1939. This was a time marked by economic hardship, political extremism, and a gradual unraveling of the fragile peace.
Take Italy, for instance. Despite being on the winning side of WW1, Italy was deeply unhappy with the territorial settlements agreed upon at Versailles and elsewhere. They felt they hadn't received the land they were promised or felt entitled to.
Plus, economic problems.
Combined with a poor domestic economy after the war, this discontent created fertile ground for political change. The sources explicitly link this unhappiness to the gradual rise of Mussolini and the establishment in Italy of what they call the first ever fascist state.
A new and dangerous ideology.
Rejecting democracy and advocating for a strong, centralized, nationalistic, and often militaristic state.
For Germany, the post-war period was a national trauma. Having lost the war, they were burdened with the harsh reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles.
The German economy was already devastated by the war, and the scale of the required payments seemed insurmountable. The German government repeatedly tried to explain its inability to meet the demands.
But France wasn't listening.
The French, whose territory had suffered immensely during the war, were particularly insistent on receiving these payments, viewing them as essential for their own recovery and for keeping Germany weak. In 1923, when Germany defaulted on some payments.
After failing to pay smoothly in 1922.
Right. France, against British advice, took the drastic step of occupying the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr region, to seize resources directly.
How did Britain and the U.S. see it?
The British, seeing the instability this caused and wanting a more functioning German economy, were more sympathetic than the French. The U.S. also tried to help, notably through the Dawes Plan.
What was the Dawes Plan?
This U.S.-led initiative provided loans to Germany, specifically designed to help the German government stabilize its currency and economy so that it could then afford to pay reparations to France and Britain, who could then pay back their war loans to the U.S.
Wow, a complex circle of debt.
It was a complex, circular flow of money intended to ease the pressure.
There were other attempts to build a more stable peace, the Locarno Treaties in 1925.
British initiated, aimed at settling border disputes and guaranteeing peace in Western Europe. And in 1928, 65 nations, including the U.S. and France, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact.
Where they renounced war.
Yes, a symbolic agreement where they renounced war as an instrument of national policy. Noble intentions, certainly.
But then came 1929.
However, all these efforts towards stabilization were dealt a serious setback in 1929 with the onset of the global economic crisis, the Great Depression. This crisis triggered a collapse in international trade, plummeting industrial production, and mass unemployment worldwide.
The Great Depression hit Germany particularly hard, didn't it?
Yes, derailing its fragile economic recovery, which was heavily reliant on foreign loans, like those from the Dawes Plan. The sources point out that the German people, facing rampant inflation and unprecedented unemployment, became increasingly angry and disillusioned with their government's inability to cope,
creating an opening for extremists.
This economic despair provided fertile ground for extremist political groups. Germany, after World War I, had established a democratic government, the Weimar Republic. While it had some periods of stability under figures like Gustav Strussmann, its foundations were always shaky due to war defeat, economic problems, and political division.
And the Depression was the final blow.
The sources state that the systematic weakness of German society after the 1929 economic crisis, exacerbated by the government's failure to resolve domestic issues and the ongoing reparations burden, led directly to the collapse of the Weimar Republic by 1932. This collapse, in turn, paved way of rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party.
So the interwar period wasn't just a pause. It was a period where the unresolved issues of the war treaties, combined with global economic collapse, created a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped new, dangerous ideologies and assertive new powers.
In Germany, the collapse of the Weimar Republic opened the door wide for the Nazi Party. They offered a powerful campaign of hope, appealing to a desperate population by promising economic revival, an end to reparations, and a restoration of national pride after the humiliation of Versailles.
And people responded.
Their promises resonated. By 1933, the Nazi Party had achieved a handsome electoral victory, leading to Adolf Hitler becoming chancellor. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to dismantle the Treaty of Versailles, openly restarting military and economic production, defying the limits imposed after WW1.
Restoring fierce national pride.
He worked aggressively to restore that sense, often through aggressive rhetoric and policies. Beyond restoring the economy and military, Hitler pursued a radical ideology. The sources mention his adoption of the theory of racial superiority,
Propounded by Goebbels.
notably propounded by Joseph Goebbels, which tragically culminated in the systematic persecution and murder of Jews and other minorities in the Holocaust. He also announced his policy of Lebensraum.
Lebensraum. Living space.
Exactly. The policy, as explained in the sources, was based on Hitler's belief that Germany needed more territory than it currently possessed in order to flourish and achieve its full potential.
And how would they get it?
This expansion, he asserted, would be achieved by the conquest of war. This meant looking east, towards Eastern Europe and the territories lost by Russia, as areas for German expansion and settlement.
While Germany was undergoing this radical transformation, other significant power shifts were occurring globally, profoundly impacting international relations. Let's look at Russia and Japan during this interwar period.
Starting with Russia, the sources take us back to around 1900 under the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar held absolute power with no real accountability to the Duma, the elected assembly. Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 exposed the Tsar's weakness and contributed to widespread discontent, reviving underground socialist parties like the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks.
And World War I pushed things over the edge.
Russia's involvement in World War I, with its immense casualties and economic strain, further intensified demands for reform and ultimately led to revolution. 1917 saw two revolutions: the February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar, and then the more radical October Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks.
Bringing the Bolsheviks to power.
This second revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, committed to establishing a communist state. As World War I ended, the new Bolshevik government in Russia signed the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918.
Which cost them huge territories.
Yes, this treaty resulted in Russia losing vast territories, including Poland, Georgia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Lenin then faced a brutal civil war against anti-Bolshevik forces, including Mensheviks and Tsarists.
Well, you won.
He succeeded in consolidating power, leading to the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, in 1922. The sources identify this as the world's first communist state.
And the West was suspicious.
Its very existence and its revolutionary ideology created enormous suspicion amongst the Western states, which were predominantly capitalist democracies.
Then Lenin died, and Stalin took over.
Lenin died in 1924, and Joseph Stalin emerged as the leader. Stalin ruthlessly consolidated his power through what the sources refer to as purges, widespread campaigns of political repression, arrests, show trials, and executions aimed at eliminating any real or perceived opposition.
And the Gulag.
He also relied on the Gulag, a vast system of forced labor camps that imprisoned millions. Stalin ruled through absolute control and, like Hitler, sought to regain territories, specifically those lost in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He ruled till 1953.
So while Western Europe grappled with economic depression and the rise of fascism and Nazism, a massive, ideologically opposed communist state was consolidating power in the East, viewed with profound distrust by the West.
This ideological divide would shape global dynamics for decades. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Japan was also undergoing significant changes and asserting itself as a major power.
Their transformation started earlier, right?
Yeah.
With Commodore Perry.
The sources trace Japan's modern transformation back to 1853, when U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry's arrival forced Japan to open up to trade, particularly using the port of Yokohama. This event was widely seen as a national humiliation in Japan, exposing its technological and military backwardness compared to the West.
Which fueled modernization.
This humiliation fueled a desire for rapid modernization and strength. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 saw the Emperor Meiji regain effective political power, and Japan embarked on a crash course of economic and military modernization, adopting Western technology and institutions.
Leading to expansionism.
This modernization quickly led to expansionist aims, notably in Korea and Manchuria. Japan's rapid rise and new military strength were demonstrated by its successful wars against China in 1894-95 and Russia in 1904-05.
Defeating Russia was huge.
Defeating a major European power like Russia firmly established Japan as a major power actor of the Far East. Japan also aligned itself with Britain through a military pact in 1906, joined the Allied side in World War I, helping Britain attack German bases in China, attended the Versailles Conference, and became a member of the League of Nations.
But the Great Depression hit Japan hard, too.
Yes, like Germany, Japan was hit hard by the global economic crisis of 1929. The domestic economy faced severe problems, and the civilian government under Emperor Hirohito struggled to control corruption and manage the crisis effectively. There were also increasing tensions with China over Japan's interests in Manchuria,
allowing the military to step in.
The perceived weakness of the civilian government during the economic crisis allowed the Japanese army to exert increasing influence and ultimately take control of policy. Fearing that China's pressure could lead to the loss of their important outpost in Manchuria, the Japanese army took matters into its own hands and attacked Manchuria in 1931, acting without the approval of the civilian government in Tokyo.
The government couldn't stop them.
The prime minister at the time, Inukai Tsuyoshi, ordered the army to halt its operations, but the army simply refused to obey. China appealed to the League of Nations for intervention.
How did the League respond?
The League investigated and, while finding fault with both sides, ultimately ordered Japan to withdraw its troops from Manchuria. Japan's response was defiant. It refused to comply with the League's directive and, in 1933, formally withdrew its membership from the League of Nations.
And the League couldn't enforce its decision.
The sources point out that the European powers, particularly Britain and France, were economically weakened by the Great Depression and reluctant to impose meaningful sanctions or take military action against Japan to enforce the League's ruling.
So the Manchurian crisis showed the League's weakness.
Clearly. This crisis, the sources state, clearly asserted the failure of the League of Nations to ensure compliance when faced with a determined major power. Japan remained a dominant, increasingly militaristic power in Asia until its defeat in World War II.
So by the mid to late 1930s, the world stage looked incredibly volatile. The unresolved grievances from WW1, the economic desperation of the Depression, the weakness of international institutions like the League,
and the rise of aggressive, expansionist regimes in Germany, Nazi, Italy, fascist, Japan, militaristic, and the suspicious Soviet Union, communist.
It had recreated a powder keg far more dangerous than the one in 1914.
And it exploded in 1939. The sources state that Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939 again plunged Europe into conflict, marking the start of World War II, which would last 6 devastating years, from September 1939 to September 1945.
The initial phase of the war, roughly from September 1939 to December 1940, saw Hitler execute his Lebensraum policy with brutal attacks on Poland and Czechoslovakia.
Simultaneously, the Soviet Union under Stalin consolidated its control over territories it had lost in 1918 through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, absorbing Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland, taking advantage of the chaos.
Germany unleashed its new military doctrine of blitzkrieg, or lightning war.
Using coordinated air and ground forces with incredible speed. This resulted in rapid conquests of Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and ultimately the stunning defeat of France. Only Britain remained defiant.
Facing the aerial onslaught of the Battle of Britain in September 1940.
Which the sources note the British retaliated well against, a crucial defense.
The alliances continued to shift in surprising ways. In June 1941, Germany, despite its anti-communist ideology, concluded a pact of non-aggression with the Soviet Union.
A temporary arrangement that shocked the world. But this pact was short-lived. In October 1941, Hitler brutally violated the agreement with Operation Barbarossa, launching a massive invasion of the Soviet Union.
A huge gamble. Did it succeed?
The German army made significant inroads, but ultimately failed to defeat Russia. The sources attribute this failure to the hostile climate and an excessively harsh Russian winter, which ground the German advance to a halt outside Moscow and Leningrad, proving catastrophic for their forces.
While Europe was consumed by this struggle, events in the Pacific were reaching a boiling point.
Yes. Emperor Hirohito of Japan initially seemed hesitant about a full-scale war, but the military, emboldened by Germany's early successes in Europe and driven by its own expansionist goals, pushed for further adventurism.
And they had a pact with Germany.
The Japanese military had concluded a pact with Germany, securing German support in the event of conflict with the United States. This pact became critical on December 7, 1941.
Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese army launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This unprovoked strike was the direct trigger that brought the hitherto reticent USA into the conflict. The U.S. immediately declared war on Japan.
And, fulfilling its agreement with Japan, Germany then declared war on the United States.
With the U.S. now fully committed, the war became truly global in scope, and the balance of power shifted decisively. The sources state that U.S. entry was an absolute game changer.
With the U.S. in the war, the Allies had the industrial and military might needed to turn the tide.
In Europe, U.S., British, and French forces launched invasions, starting with Sicily, which contributed to the downfall of Mussolini in Italy. Sicily then served as a base for Allied advances into the Balkans and Central Europe.
A pivotal moment in the European theater was the opening of the Second Front in Western Europe, June 6, 1944.
Operation Overlords. The massive Allied D-Day landings in Normandy. This forced Germany to fight a two-front war against the Western Allies in France and the Soviets in the East, compelling the Germans to retreat from France and Russia,
leading to Germany's defeat.
Facing overwhelming pressure from East and West, Germany's position became untenable. By May 1945, Germany was defeated and surrendered unconditionally. Britain and the U.S. then focused their combined efforts on defeating Japan in the Pacific.
The war against Japan was brutal,
with the U.S. systematically destroying the Japanese military, navy, and air power in island-hopping campaigns. The final terrible act of the war came in August 1945.
The atomic bombs.
The United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. These devastating attacks led to the total Japanese surrender by August 14, 1945, finally bringing World War II to an end.
The sources list the major players in this second, even more destructive global conflict. The Axis powers included Germany, Italy, Japan, along with Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria.
And the Allied powers were a much larger coalition, including the U.S., Britain, France, the USSR, and numerous others like Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, China, Denmark, Greece, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia.
The human cost was immense, far exceeding World War I.
The end of World War II marked a definitive shift in the global order. The League of Nations, having failed its primary purpose, was disbanded and replaced by the United Nations, envisioned as a new, more effective arbitrator of peace.
But perhaps the most impactful outcome, as the sources highlight, was the clear emergence of the USA and Russia emerging victorious from the conflict.
This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a fundamental bipolar shift in global power.
This victory by these two specific powers immediately ushered the world into a new era, the Cold War.
The sources hint that analyzing the post-war settlements and dynamics of 1945 is a topic requiring further exploration, as the foundation for this next global confrontation was laid in the very moments of victory.
Wow. To recap that journey, we started with the European continent, supercharged by industry, but paralyzed by suspicion and rivalry, forming alliances that ultimately pulled them into the First Global War.
Then the attempt at peace through treaties like Versailles left deep wounds, especially in Germany and Italy, and the global economic crisis exacerbated the instability,
paving the way for the rise of extremist ideologies and assertive powers like Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militaristic Japan, alongside the suspicious Soviet Union.
The League of Nations, born of noble intentions, proved incapable of containing these forces, its weaknesses starkly revealed by crises like Japan's invasion of Manchuria. Ultimately, the unresolved grievances, combined with aggressive expansionist aims, plunged the world into an even more devastating conflict.
And the conclusion of World War II didn't deliver a unified, peaceful world, but rather a new global order dominated by two emerging superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, setting the stage for decades of ideological and geopolitical struggle.
It's a powerful reminder of how historical forces, economic competition, nationalism, the dynamics of power vacuums in rising states, and the failure of international cooperation can combine with specific events to reshape the world in ways that ripple across generations.
Indeed. And thinking about that transition point, the sources mention the U.S. and Russia emerging victorious and immediately entering the Cold War. It really makes you consider, How much of the nature of that Cold War rivalry, its intensity, its specific flashpoints, wasn't just determined by their differing ideologies, but by the experiences and power structures forged during their alliance and ultimate victory in World War II?
Right. Did the shape of the next conflict start to form while they were still allies in the fight against the Axis? Something to think about as you look at the world today and how yesterday's conflicts can shape tomorrow's dynamics.